if it's one thing about video games that I love the most, it's the ongoing lore, the strange storyline that ultimately composes itself when a multitude of video games that inevitably come out as sequels, prequels, and spin-offs. Though obviously a lot of the time, not all these things are canon, sometimes it's fun to just shove things together and imagine what if it did work all together as canon. Today I'm talking about the Castlevania franchise, a franchise that ultimately has spun around all the way since 1986 when the original Castlevania, also known as Akamojo Dracula in Japan, Castlevania is a franchise that has spanned all the way to modern day, even though it's had a multitude of big gaps in between, especially after the near ending of the franchise, which was a sort of reboot, with the most recent game being a remake of a game for the arcade, which nobody played ever. Castlevania as a franchise has ultimately spawned not just a whole bunch of sequels and prequels, but also a whole bunch of games in the genre vaguely known as Metroidvania. In 1997, Castlevania Symphony of the Night would come out for the PS1, made of course by Toru Higihara, and written by Koji Igarashi, which will be a name pretty important for this video. It would take inspiration from the Metroid series, mostly Super Metroid, and being an exploration-based action-adventure game, which of course you would explore, put out your map, and then ultimately find all the things which you aren't sure if they're going to be relevant till you go into a whole separate part of the area and go, oh, it's for this! A whole slew of games have been inspired by both franchises, and it's really spawned like its own little family of games, with the masters of it, of course, being both of those franchises. Some of the best of the genre comes from what the genre is named after, surely. And of course, we have Castlevania to relatively thank for it. Castlevania followed up by its sequel Simon's Quest soon afterwards, and one that is vaguely about Simon haunted castle for the arcade.
Blah, blah, blah.
And soon afterwards being followed up by two different prequels, one that is several years before Castlevania the Adventure for the Game Boy, and then three, Dracula's Curse, all being all the way into the supposedly first Belmont, soon being followed up by the other Game Boy game Belmont Revenge before the remake of the original Super Castlevania 4, where you can do the weird whip thing, soon followed up by Rondo of Blood and Bloodlines. Gotta spread out your different stories for different game systems because that's just what the series did back then. Symphony of the Night following up with Rondo of Blood and also its SNES version Dracula X, a way lesser version of Rondo of Blood, being released right near the last Game Boy game, Legends, which also might be a Belmont before Trevor from 3. Then you got 64 and its actual finished version released the same year, Legacy of Darkness, which ultimately is somewhere in the middle of all of that, and then almost a follow-up to that Game Boy game that would have been just also somewhere in the middle of that for the Dreamcast, which never happened. Eventually, Igarashi would take care of the franchise here going forward with, which after Circle of the Moon, which had nothing to do with him on the Game Boy Advance, a slew of games on the Game Boy Advance and later DS, and 2 on the PS2 would bring us all the way into 2008, where after the remake of Castlevania the Adventure on the WiiWare online store in 2009, the Castlevania franchise would basically be rebooted with Lords of Shadow. Eventually, Lords of Shadow 2 in 2014 would seemingly end the franchise for 10 whole years until when they started making the nice little collections and putting them out. Haunted Castle was remade to be a more playable game. The Castlevania franchise has had its ups and downs. Not every game has been perfect, but it has certainly made this little tapestry of a strange lineage of the Belmonts, this clan of vampire hunters that have had relatively the same whip, the Vampire Killer Whip, all the way since the actual first Belmont, Leon Belmont, in one of the mentioned 2 PS2 games. Hell, there is a multitude of other spin-off games and other media that I did not mention that I certainly will in a little bit. But, you know, what is the canon of Castlevania? Well, if you're Igarashi, it's mostly the ones he made and the ones made a little bit before him, right? And then ignoring all the ones that he didn't like. But I tell you, why is that the canon? What, because the man who was behind the franchise and hasn't been for a nearly 20 years has said so? I doubt it. In truth, I think that it's a lot more interesting to put whatever you want. Now, there's multiple things ultimately you'll see in the video that you'll go, but like, that can't be. But it ain't a thing. And I'll certainly get over the ones that annoy me the most, but I would basically tell you that, A, this is my video, shut up, and B, use your imagination, alright? God sakes. It is not hard to just use your imagination and go, well, 2 things can be the truth at the same time. Why does one thing being written down by one guy result in one thing written by another guy suddenly being invalid? Very odd, right? So follow me through the canon of the timeline of Castlevania, not through the events, but through the family tree of the Belmonts. That's right, I have taken the fully official family tree, shoved in the extra ones on where they probably make sense, and then added as much as I can to fill out the family tree. This family tree, note, will probably not make full sense. Just go with it, and let's have fun. Starting all the way in the beginning, we have Gabriel Belmont. Now, of course, Gabriel Belmont is in Orders of Shadow, and that is the series that is purposefully not canon to the main Castlevania franchise. However, Gabriel Belmont toward the ending turns into Dracula, and thus we know that Gabriel Belmont can't be the same kind of Belmont line that we have in the main timeline, and he certainly can't be Dracula. Trust me, I tried very hard to be like, well, maybe there were two Draculas at the same time, but it just wouldn't make sense. And I'm gonna have a lot of ass pulls in this video, so just note that that would have been a step too far. But I raised the question of, hey, what's this pachinko game doing here? Oh, gambling. I raise you the idea that in the timeline where the main series happens, which is the ka-ching, ka-ching, pachinko, get your money, is of course where we have the actual Gabriel Belmont and Felicia Belmont being the earliest Belmonts in our timeline. In the Lord of Shadow timeline, where they come from would naturally be well before even Leon Belmont. I raise you the fact that I do think that this Gabriel Belmont did the same thing as Lords of Shadow, but ultimately went the good path, thanks to his sister being there the whole time with him to make sure that that didn't happen. Thanks, gambling. I'd imagine he still had a son known as Trevor or Ralph. There's going to be a few characters with the same names in here. We'll get to that later, so I'll go with Ralph, which, by the way, is the Japanese name of Trevor Belmont. So, you know, now you know that they called him Ralph in Japan. Ralph Belmont, I believe, is the father of Leon Belmont. We never know this father of Leon Belmont in the actual games, and that we barely know much about Leon Belmont's, life before the events of the game that he appears in majorly. Lament of Innocence in 2003 ultimately shows you Leon Belmont going to take his love who had been kidnapped by monsters from the evil vampire Walter. It's what an odd name, right? Going through Walter's castle, he fights a multitude of monsters and gains help from a funny little alchemist who gives him this whip which is able to be strong enough to fight against monsters. Leon himself is, of course, a man of the highest order of the Crusaders, who at this point were failing to do the Crusades, so it's kind of better that he decided to do monster stuff instead of join in the Crusades. Otherwise, we'd be talking about, I don't know, Dante from Dante's Inferno. After fighting a whole bunch of awesome, weird-looking monsters, including the awesome vampire Joaquin, and probably meeting up with Pumpkin, he eventually finds out that Sarah is unfortunately going to become a vampire, and there's no way of stopping it, and he can't defeat Walter with his kind of whip. But ultimately, he is told that he can make his whip even stronger, would require Sarah's sacrifice. Leon is unwilling, but Sarah is, and she sacrifices herself to turn the whip that he had into the notable Vampire Hunter whip. Hey, before we continue, I just want to note that I do in fact say the Vampire Hunter whip 1,000 times, and I know that it's the Vampire Killer whip, and I even say it correctly sometimes in the video. Cut me some slack here. It's a very, similar name to the other whips in the series. Just go with it. Just know when I say it wrong, I didn't mean to. Shut up. The Vampire Hunter whip will have the soul of Sarah throughout the franchise, and it is because of her that the whip is as strong as it is. After the defeat of Walter, that is seemingly it. However, we get the reason why there is the blood feud with the Belmonts and Dracula when ultimately Matthias Cronquist comes out with his own magic stone and goes, I needed the magic stone of Walter in order to become a cool-ass vampire man. His magic stone has the big-ass evil spirit Death, and thus it is the reason why Death is always with him. And more likely, merging the stones apparently gave him the power of chaos, as later established in the furthest part of our timeline, that supposedly there is a chaotic god which gives Dracula his powers in some way, which is why he can turn into big-ass monsters. It is also probably looking like a crow sometimes. He wants revenge for the fact that his wife, Elizabetha Conquest, had died a long time ago, and he decides to turn himself into an evil, cool-ass monster man, renaming himself into Dracula Tepesh. I don't know why he decided to take that name, but he sure does. And ultimately, he takes Walter's castle, changes it into Dracula's Castle, also known in universe as Castlevania, probably thanks to the fact that vampires apparently have the ability to learn the arcane and alchemy, eventually learn like a little bit more modern tech well further in the future than he probably should be able to. And Leon basically promises that, hey, I'm going to pledge my entire life of just to fuck yours over. Every single one of my descendants will follow suit. Oddly, I don't know if they ever fight ever again, because there's never another game with Leon, but I'd like to imagine maybe. But Dracula ultimately kind of just mellows out for a little bit and just does his own thing, making monsters and stuff, finding monsters, both of them probably, but definitely, teaming up and clanning with other vampires which exist throughout the world. Now, the anime itself isn't necessarily canon, but I would like to imagine elements from it can be, and that's why I'd like to imagine a lot of those guys from other parts of the world are essentially wowed by Dracula's power, and Dracula becomes top shit of the vampires. As we later see in the franchise, the Order of Shadows is this secretive organization that is established in a separate mobile game, but considering there's lots of guys in black robes throughout the series, it's probable that all of them are part of the Order of Shadows, and all of them are the cult that kind of then surrounds Dracula, which I'd like to imagine is established in between Leon and the next named Belmont. A cult that has to take a while to form, so might as well. Now, made up names for these characters. Maybe some of them look like characters from other games that we know. Maybe some of them are some of the characters from the game that now Castlevania has crossed over with. I don't know. But eventually, the first major Belmont that makes its first appearance is a character I have named Raymond, who is the grandfather of Sonya Belmont. I don't know why I named him that, but that sure is what I called him. The first named main Belmont will be Sonya Belmont, and the events of that game, Castlevania Legends, happen somewhere in the 1400s. So that's approximately like 400-something years, with just no clear Belmont happening. I'm not sure how many Belmonts happen in between Leon and her, but I know at the very least two, as we know about her grandfather being the man that raised her, and it's clear that her parents had died while hunting monsters. I gave my own fan name. I just like the name Raymond Belmont for some reason, and I decided to name him son Darian. Darian, who of course is named after the very artist who I will be using the art for. Go follow him on everything that I will now link in the right on screen and also in the description. But they probably died due to the fact that Dracula is now going full-on, human killing mode at this point in the timeline. When it comes down to it, the part of the timeline where things really get crazy is, of course, the part of the timeline where Dracula does meet his next wife. Dracula Tepesh meets Lisa, who becomes Lisa Tepesh, who then, of course, has Alucard Fahrenheit Tepesh. She helps raise him and learn the many different kinds of strange magics, which eventually gets her caught by the church, who of course burn her for being a witch. Depicted in this little manga that was in the Konami magazine called Nocturne in the Moonlight, that gives us the exact events of the day of when Dracula and Alucard had to deal with the fact that Lisa had now just been murdered by the church. It's clear due to this that the Belmonts immediately jumped into action, and more than likely is the reason why Sonya's parents are dead, and why her grandfather is so protective of her, but did try to make sure that she was trained in order to fight these monsters just in case. It's also probably the reason why Alucard is a family friend and begins to try to make peace with the Belmonts and probably to get Sonya ready. This eventually leads, of course, into Castlevania Legends. Ultimately, it is Sonya that is the first Belmont to go against Dracula as Dracula and actively succeeds, right? She goes through the whole of Dracula's castle, fights against the many weird-looking monsters in that game, with the most important part of our discussion being the fact that she does fight Alucard and does result in him going into the little coffin that you find him in 3. After defeating Dracula but not killing him, it weakens him enough so that he takes a little bit longer for when he restarts his rampage, when, inevitably, we get to Trevor. The ending of the game is the reason why people ultimately have Legends as non-canon, and I'm going to explain to you why I think it's fine that it's canon. At the end, this particular wording that people use is that it implies the fact that it is two lineages that come together, and that her son, Trevor, is seemingly the son of both her and Alucard. However, I raised to you that A, this wording is weird and could easily be, it is a not two lineages, but a lineage of two things. Gonna pull out that Yu-Gi-Oh! Description wording BS on ya. But that more importantly, how could it be Alucard? It mentions that he was born several years later. In fact, we have the exact date that Trevor is born, put it on screen. And it is not the same, year that this game takes place, which we know when it takes place, put it on screen. So for that to happen, she either A, was pregnant while fighting Dracula and kept that baby in with her the strongest fucking iron gooch ever, or B, did a thing while Alucard was sleeping. So pick your choice, because the real third choice, which everyone should pick, is that Alucard isn't the father. Trust me, going into this, making this whole thing, I was like, yeah, sure, all right. I'll make the joke that Alucard is Trevor's dad, but in reality, when you think about the year gap, the several year gap even, it's not feasibly possible. So yeah, with that out of the way, and the fact that legends can easily be canon, and if you really just, use your imagination, Sonya inevitably leads to Trevor Belmont, who never really gets to enjoy the nice riches of the Belmont family, I guess, as inevitably they blame the Belmonts of all things after Sonya's doings, when Trevor was only a little bab, and they burn their house down, and they run them out of town. The Belmonts are left to their own vices, and Trevor lives in a very rough household. Unclear if Trevor has any siblings. This will happen several times on this timeline, but we know the tale of Trevor Belmont eventually being asked when he made his way back into town and kicks a monster ass, and then eventually getting the help of cool witch lady, part of a clan of mages, Dracula's very own son, Alucard, who isn't his father at all, and also a little strange pirate man that they basically save from turning into a monster. Yeah, you don't have him in the anime, but he looks all funny. His name is Grant Dynasty or Dynasty. I'm calling him Dynasty, so if Dynasty annoys you, then get ready for that in various parts of the video. But it will be these three heroes that will help the legendary Belmont take down Dracula for the first time, as Dracula eventually turns into his big crow form, which is, again, probably the chaos god that gives him power, taking, manifest at this point. They defeat him so well that it basically sets him on this path that basically now results in his soul regenerating every 100 years, so that Trevor now realizes he has to make sure that his lineage is ready for the future when that eventually happens. But also, at any point, anyone can just try and bring him back before that point, and boy will they try. And thus we have the continuing cycle of the Castlevania franchise. This is what will be the series going forward. So note that when the plot summaries get a little bit, less dynamic. Now here is where we get to the story of Hector and Isaac, two of the Devil Forge Masters. It's through this that we see that, sure, maybe some monsters are just naturally a thing in the universe, but some are made by what is very clearly talented and lifelong magic users, which can apparently use their powers to create monsters for Dracula, and they did so for a very long time. But it seems that they weren't able to help Dracula when he was defeated by Trevor. As seen in the anime based on the third game, Isaac and Hector they don't live that great of a life, and ultimately are not really helpful when it comes to the death of Dracula, but they soon have to deal with the fact that because of that now, they have to move on with their lives. Now, whether or not you want to believe Hector was then seduced by the small little vampire lady, sure, but either way, Isaac hates Hector for the fact that Death really wants to use him instead, and that Dracula kind of favored Hector over him. Isaac eventually decides to just mess with Hector's life, and Hector, who had fallen in love by this point, found by the church to apparently have done witchcraft, and it's all a ploy by Isaac, who apparently was behind it the whole time, just to make sure that Hector would, come and get him. It will be this that would essentially be in order for Death to use Hector in order to bring back Dracula. Hector would fight against Isaac, and then of course Trevor, who would be relatively knowledgeable of this, and also a crazy time-traveling man who may or may not come from the anime universe. I'd like to imagine personally the anime is in a separate universe, but this version of Saint Germain isn't, and that after going through that weird portal, he became a strange time traveler man. And then maybe the reason that there's differences between the anime and games is because of the man. Who knows? Time travel's weird like that. Either way, eventually Hector with his cool little monster guys fights against Isaac and his strange little monster boys, and it's Isaac that is used to almost resurrect Dracula. But of course, you know, Hector, with relative help from Trevor, is able to stop Dracula's full ascent into existence and eventually is able to go on his life normally. What happens to Hector after that is I'm not sure, but it's cool to see a Castlevania game that isn't directly involving the Belmonts. So when Rondo of Blood and Bloodlines were being made, both teams decided to make this mock-up little family tree which connected these characters from where it was from Trevor to Simon to Christopher to, at that point, Richter, right? And also the characters from Bloodlines. It's a little bit odd because, as we know, literally in the canon timeline, in the canon known family tree, this is not entirely correct, but we can take parts of it and use it as ways to kind of add to our little family tree, and thus that's why these characters do exist that I'll talk about. Thus, with that, we get Anne, Mary, and Frederick, all of which are the apparently canon names to the 3 children that Trevor has with Sypha. Frederick being the oldest, with Anne and Mary being the younger daughters. Anne will marry Lloyd Morris and will lead into the Morris clan, and we'll certainly get to them years later. While Mary will marry Leo Helsing, and it will eventually lead into Van Helsing. Yes, Van Helsing, as in Abraham Van Helsing, which is his actual name from the book. I don't know what exactly the people who are making these were on. We'll really get to why Abraham Van Helsing is apparently canon to this, and also why that matters, but it's just funny that canonically there is no Abraham Van Helsing, there's Van Helsing. It's just weird. More important is Frederick Belmont, who may be that guy from the Castlevania-inspired Yu-Gi-Oh card. Both are Konami. We know eventually it'll lead into Christopher Belmont, but of course, not too soon after the events of 3, several years afterwards, will lead into Sid Belmont. I decided to put here a very important character to a thing that I will explain later. But here we have Trevor Belmont II, and also his wife, also named Sypha. I'm just going to leave it as a lot of Belmonts will just name their kids after each other, and also there are many Syphas in the Belnades clan. We'll go with that. But the more important discussion here is Sid and Zook Belnades, right? As we are talking about all aspects of Castlevania, we're going to talk about the 2 game books. 2 choose-your-own-adventure books that are trying to put themselves into the canon of Castlevania, which are about 2 other unheard-of Belmonts, one of which is Sid Belmont. Sid Belmont, who looks very much like a crazy 90s anime protagonist, is mentioned to be specifically a descendant of Trevor Belmont. This was clearly written before they firmly understood that Trevor would canonically get with Sypha Belnades, and thus they have Zook Belnades, a man who is implicitly said to be a descendant of Sypha Belnades. And he's not the only character throughout the series to have this sort of distinction. It is implicitly said, but from Carrie Fernandez, from Castlevania 64, and also Yoko Belnades, and also Charlotte Alwyn, all of which are mentioned to specifically be descendants of Sypha Belnades, which means that all of them are part of this family tree. Let's take a little bit of a separate time to just kind of imply that after Sid Belmont would do what his grandfather had trained him to do, he teams up with the other descendants of the other great heroes. That's right, Castlevania Legends of the Satanic Castle ultimately also has Ro Dynasty, a descendant of Grant, and Layla, who is a descendant of Alucard, who presumably is Alucard's daughter. That is sure a thing. I don't know who her mom is, or if she was reproduced by budding, but that sure is a thing that I'm now implying is canon. If you don't like it, then let's just not talk about it. The 2 or 3 of them that we want to pretend exist to ultimately fight off Dracula and stop his full resurrection. Zook would decide that he would want to continue with the Belnades clan of teaching and would go and change his name, and it is from him that we would get the Belnades clan. Eventually, many centuries later, we would get Yoko, who I believe descends from Laura, who is part of a group of characters who I will certainly talk about as we go through the timeline, as that all come from Order of Ecclesia, who are different descendants of the Belmont clan of unclear connection, of which all were lured there by the Order of Ecclesia. Thus, I will be putting them in places where I feel like they naturally fit, and by the way, it'll kind of just be mostly in one area later on. But one part of this family eventually separates into the Fernandez clan. This is a funny little side of the series, in that we get, of course, Carrie Fernandez in the N64 game, whose father was Collar. Collar, who was a character who was supposed to be in the original game that they ultimately cut, and I'm deciding that he is in fact her father, who is lost somewhere, and that character is also the guy who is seen to be an enemy, which of course was just the reusing of that model. I like the idea that the reason he isn't there is because, well, he's a Frankenstein now, or I guess Frankenstein's monster. Not important. Point is, the Fernandez clan is pretty important to that game, as is Camilla Fernandez. Obviously not the same Camilla as most of the series, as if there's more than likely several, and of course she is the cousin of Carrie Fernandez. But what's weird is originally I was thinking it was going to be Carrie's mom who was part of the clan, you know, which thing. But then in this Chinese mobile game, of which I will certainly talk about later, but has been released in modern times, there's a character named Leah Fernandez, who, guess what, similarly is a descendant of Saifa Belmonts. So thus, suddenly, I have to shift the entirety of what I had planned on who was related to whom. It's not much of a shift, but it's still weird that out of nowhere, here comes this character, which oddly, you know, connects a certain part of the series to another. So here it is. Whatever happens to Leah, either her or Carrie eventually leads into Charlotte Allen, and more likely, Carrie's daughter / Charlotte's grandma is probably that one witch from that other arcade game. That again, we'll get to all where they come later. Sid, timeline-wise, is the natural person to be the father of Christopher Belmont. We do actually see Christopher Belmont's parents, who are unnamed, as corpses in what is apparently the Belmont estate. I guess they got it back and rebuilt it. I'm just going to thank Trevor Belmont II, who I'm still establishing is fully canon, keep him in mind. I'm going with the fact that Sid married a woman named Sybil, whose name of course comes from this incredibly, vaguely connected, but not at all official story that was licensed by Konami, that was in a magazine that ran for a small amount of time, that basically goes through the lineage of the Belmonts, except it implies that all of them are not fully related, and also Simon is a vampire. Again, there's a bunch of things that I don't think are canon. I'm just taking ideas from and putting them into their own canon versions of these characters. Sybil is one of those Belmonts and came well before Simon, and thus this part of the timeline would probably be where she'd be. I like the idea that there was a cool whip-wielding badass bitch who, alongside Sid, fought monsters, inevitably dying before Christopher would fully be able to come of age, in which during that point he began to train with the whip. It would be during that time it would be Castlevania the Adventure, and it would be by his own he would fight against Dracula. It would be time for his full resurrection after the 100-something years, and now it's time to fight Dracula. Ultimately scaling the castle, defeating Dracula with relative ease, or with a lot of weird-ass challenges depending on which version we're looking at. P.S. In terms of remakes and stuff, I am counting all of them as canon, and I'm just saying that all of it happened to them at once. It's easier that way. Use your imagination. In between his two adventures, he would meet up with Ilyana Belmont. Ilyana from the awesome comic that is Castlevania The Legacy would be in between the two Castlevania The Adventure games, and would be about the uncovering of part of the evil cult that did exist within universe, which are now currently being led by a group which has a name which you may kind of recognize. It's led by Ivan Bartley and his niece Sonya Bartley, and you might know this name because it of course is the same name as Elizabeth Bartley. The character from the anime has a slightly different version of this name, but is very clearly that same character, and also that same historical person, which both these versions of the character are based on. I raise you the idea that Elizabeth Bartley, who is said to be related to Dracula in some capacity in the games themselves, has been given a sort of like honorary title as niece of Dracula after she and her clan decided to basically pledge themselves to Dracula, and it would be there that they would have a connection towards Dracula. Now, whether or not you want to know that her powers came from the same crazy-ass Egyptian thing that it did in the anime is up to you. But it's very clear at some point she was mortal and became a vampire, and I would like to imagine she's part of the same family as these Bartleys, which were named this way on purpose. And that's why these guys are so ready to fucking go to bat for Dracula and nearly bring him back to life. With help of his awesome wife, Christopher is able to stop the full resurrection of Dracula, and seemingly things are perfectly fine. But very clearly, Dracula's spirit of his partially reborn self hides itself in the being born body of Solio Belmont. It will be this that he would unlock this Dracula personality when he would come of age several years later in Castlevania The Adventure 2. Solio Belmont would inevitably try to work with Dracula's forces and attempt to fully bring him back, but it would be after Christopher would beat he ass that he would ultimately be able to stop Dracula's full resurrection once more and once again seal Dracula and Castlevania. As seen by that little family tree, we're going back to that, there were two other people. Gerhardt Belmont, who has no descendants apparently, and Amanda Belmont, who would marry Leif Erikson. That's right, the one from
Hey everybody, it's Leif Erikson Day! Hinga-dinga-durgan!
Which would lead into Bolt Erikson. That's right, distantly related to the Belmonts from Castlevania are a bunch of crazy-ass Vikings who kick ass. There are a couple characters that would naturally fit in the timeline, so there's a little bit of spots we can kind of put certain other characters. I did decide to include Sybil before due to the fact that I really wanted to include the only other character with an actual image from that same story, which is Ray Belmont. Ray Belmont, who of course taught Simon Belmont in that mentioned story, is just a cool-ass, kick-ass old guy, and I just really wanted to have him be canon. Him as a deadbeat dad who went off into the mountains to fight against monsters and was never really connected to his family is probably something that is still canon, and hell, him living so long enough that it could still teach Simon Belmont also could easily be just as canon. I'd like to imagine he was so much not there for his kids that they kind of just went off and did whatever they want, but both would still lead into two separate clans of vampire hunters. In Nocturne of Recollection, there is a mention of a family that has basically been a rival of the Belmont clan for so many years, of the Marquise family, mostly Cyril Marquise. This is his picture here, but I'm putting this picture too. This is a character that was supposed to be in a unmade game that was supposed to be a sequel to Rondo of Blood, where there was going to be, you know, a rival vampire hunter. So I'd like to imagine that the Marquise family came from Ray Belmont's other kid. They went off on their own, got a new name, and basically became rivals forever with the Belmont side of the family. This is one of those things that doesn't need to be the case, and if you don't want to think that this character, that is canon, because it was basically approved by the guy who decided what is and what isn't canon. But hey, if you don't want to assume certain things as canon because you can live your own life, then that's fine. And if you want to assume that it's canon and he's not related to the Belmont fam, then that's totally fine as well. But this is my video, and I already said shut up. His other son, though, is Pierre Belmont. Now, who is Pierre Belmont? Pierre Belmont is from a Goemon manga, where Goemon goes to hell and has to get help from Pierre Belmont, who just kind of fell down in a hole to hell. Pierre Belmont helps them get out and actually falls back down. And obviously this isn't canon because it is a joke manga, but he in that is mentioned to be specifically Simon Belmont's grandfather. I adore this character. I find him so funny. And out of all of like the not canon Belmonts, I go with Pierre, and I am ride or die for this strange mustached man. I like to imagine the real canon version of this guy after having his son that we'll talk about in a minute. He ultimately decided to push back demons that were coming out of hell and has now forced himself to stay there at the gates in order to keep them from coming out. His son would be Desmond Belmont, having two other kids, Zoe and Dolores, also seen in that game. Again, a mobile game, Castlevania Order of Shadows, that, you know, is an incredibly simplistic game of once again stopping the cult from resurrecting Dracula. There was a cut character in that game that also could easily be placed in the Belnades part of the family, but, you know, he doesn't exist. So who knows? Desmond's pretty cool. He's got a pretty cool design, and I feel like if any character is the closest to being canon from something that isn't canon, it's this guy, actually. He just, due to the time frame, is naturally Simon's dad, and I've always thought that well before I ever made this friggin' family tree. P.S. All the Weigel villagers are right here. I decided to put a majority of them as descendants of either Zoe or Dolores. None of them kept the Belmont name, and that's why none of their descendants have the Belmont name. Here are all of them on screen. One of them in particular does mention that she actually fought monsters and is the oldest of them, Daniela. She, of course, is a little bit of like a grandma-like figure to Shanoa, and if I really had to have it my way, I'd imagine she just is Shanoa's grandma, meaning Shanoa is herself part of the clan, which I feel like will make sense later. I promise it'll make sense, and I'm not just pulling shit out my booty. It'll make sense. Other parts of the Belmont clan I feel like are also represented in a few of the Weigel villagers, but I should note, not all of them need to. You know, maybe some of them were just too far to be drawn by Dracula's magic. I mean, none of them are any of the Eriksons, so, you know, really, I just don't know where to put them, and if I really wanted to waste my time, I'd make up a whole bunch of more names to establish even more branches in the family tree. So note that if I ever had the chance to change certain things about Castlevania canon, these guys wouldn't be placed here. P.S. Nathan Gravesome Circle of the Moon I also have placed here, you will notice, and I'm also fine with that not being the case. The man actually has nothing to do with the bloodline of the Belmonts, and he's naturally just another guy who at one point did stop the resurrection of Dracula. With that all being who he is just a random guy who did that one time, and thus why nobody really cares about Nathan Graves. But if he's a Belmont, then it matters a little bit more, doesn't it? I mean, look at that strut. That man is clearly a Belmont. But before we can get to him, let's get to the main attraction. The guy everyone knows, big boy, beefy-ass Simon Belmont, who's not at all a vampire. Though, bro's inhuman, so the next in the line, he was trained to do exactly what his ancestor did, and he went up and did it in such a crazy adventure that it's unclear whatever happened. There's so many variations on what may have happened that not everyone can keep their story straight. After beating up Dracula's spirit would also attempt to cling onto his body, and ultimately with Dracula's own curse, it would result in Simon dying over time. This was more than likely Dracula's whole plan to attempt to have him be reborn through bringing him back to life, and that would be the only way for Simon to not die. Thus the plot of Simon's Quest. After a whole bunch of dumb, stupid nonsense, Simon would gain all the parts of Dracula from Dracula's followers and resurrect him in order to murder him. One of the only times there is a successful resurrection of Dracula, which probably was so quick that it didn't matter. Simon still absolutely murders Dracula and is able to survive the next day. His wife, who has a multitude of names depending on what we're talking about, and him have a son, and eventually it'll lead to Juiced Belmont. But where? A lot of people aren't quite sure how Simon is related to Juiced Belmont, and especially how Juiced Belmont is related to Trevor. Now, the anime does help us with that, and I already firmly thought that Juiced Belmont was Richter's grandfather and not father. But it certainly didn't give us the answer of how Juiced is related to Simon. There's not even a hint at that. However, I'd imagine he's Simon's grandson, but not only grandson. Firstly, there's Simon Belmont III. Simon Belmont III is, of course, from the Konami YY World game, another wacky game made by Konami to parody their own properties with Konami Man, and I don't think that game is canon, but I'd like to imagine the Castlevania World part of that first game is canon, and thus Simon Belmont III. Instead of Konami Man saving him, it was either Juiced Belmont, who was his younger brother, I would imagine, or his father, Simon Belmont. Ooh, baby, what do I mean by that? It's time for my favorite part of the timeline of my favorite part of this theory that I've really been building up to the whole time of look at this blue-haired goofball. A misspelling in Simon Belmont's name for the arcade game Haunted Castle is why I firmly believe that the Simon Belmont from that game is Simon Belmont Jr. If there's a third, that needs to be a second, and who could that be but this man? This man who gets his wife, whose name is Selena, captured by a vampire. It could easily just not be Dracula, or Dracula, it doesn't matter. But he goes off in that crazy castle, goes through its wackiness, and if you're playing the remake and not the original, then you certainly are playing the better version of it. Please do so and don't do the original, which will drive you insane. But he beats up his big giant head, or heads, and is able to save his wife, having two sons, as we've already mentioned, which leads into two separate parts of our family tree. This alongside Desmond is one of those things I will stand by for the rest of my life, and you can argue with me as much as you want, but Simon's Belmont Jr. will always stay with me, as I'm pretty sure this is how it goes. Unclear if Simon Belmont III ever really leads to anything else. I'd like to imagine Simon Belmont III eventually leads into characters that may or may not have been in Weigel Village, eventually leading into Eric Lacard. The Lacard spear being passed down throughout the years, as Alucard still wants to help out parts of the Belmont clan, and eventually having 2 daughters, one of who I'm imagining is Stella, will eventually lead into Hermina Lacard. It's weird that the games never really go into who Hermina's like ancestor is. It just goes, it's either Stella or Loretta, and it's like, be specific, please. It has to be one of them, not both. Now, I'd love to make up names of things in between, and maybe there's another Eric in there somewhere. I'll get there later. Separately from probably one of the Weigel villagers is the Renard part of the family. Eventually from Tara, her sister, maybe one of their cousins, is that one girl from Rondo of Blood as well. Eventually leading into Maria, who of course would be, we can kind of merge the anime and the games in this way, but at the very least is good friends with Richter Belmont, Just Belmont's grandson, with Just's daughter being Julia, whom I'm very glad the anime decided to introduce. Like, before that came out, I just had this blank space of I should make up a name, but I could easily make up names for like the branches and stuff, but I just felt weird about just making up a name when it's not even like a confirmed existing character there, right? But thankfully we got Julia, another badass bitch with a whip. So that's cool. Raised probably by the Renard clan, Richter Belmont would eventually, after fighting maybe some crazy Egyptian goddess vampire lady, would meet the amazing Annette and would eventually find himself fighting against Dracula's resurrection, as in Rondo of Blood, after a multitude of action scenes leading up, facing off with him in the iconic die monster scene, which I will quote every single day of my life. Except right now. Here's where we do get a little bit fuzzy in the time frame. It's very clear that around this time frame it would be Victor Belmont from the canceled Dreamcast game, who just kind of went missing at some point, and that's the reason why the Belmont name kind of just isn't really used, right? But the Belmont name eventually, finds its way to there, so it's clear that it doesn't just go away. It's clear that canonically, Richter just goes, I'm done. I don't want to continue this family line of fighting things. And while his first son keeps the name, his second son goes, yeah, I'm not a Belmont. But his second son has the whip. Michael Schneider, the real name of the father of Reinhardt Schneider from Castlevania 64, had the whip in hand. The actual vampire killer whip is what Reinhardt uses alongside helping Harry Fernandez, there's her back again, as they together fight Dracula. Now, of course, this is after a clan of beastmen are harassed by Dracula, attempt to use the main character of Legacy of Darkness's adoptive sister to somehow use her to resurrect Dracula, but somehow the beast form of the main character, Cornell, is used instead, which results in Dracula being reborn as a little boy. One of the little boys that Cornell had saved in his adventure becomes a cool knight guy with a revolver, who of course then also at the same time as Reinhardt and Carrie goes to fight Dracula, and while they're fighting Dracula, he saves a bunch of little kids that Dracula's forces had captured in order to find which of the kids is Dracula, because I guess they didn't know which one Dracula was reborn as. Eventually, that creepy little boy who tried to be Carrie's friend is revealed to be Dracula and eventually is slain by Reinhardt Schneider. It is here that a secretive organization made by Alucard, who is pretending to be someone else entirely, then takes the whip and then gives it to a separate part of the family in order to ensure that some group of the family is doing things against any possible resurrections of Dracula, but that the actual Belmont clan cannot. While they're probably doing their own thing, fighting monsters in some way, the family that becomes the major part of the timeline is now the Morrises, so let's go on to them. The Morrises, which as we've established started all the way with Anne and Lloyd, eventually leads into who I'd like to imagine is Marcel from Order of Ecclesia. who after the Order of Ecclesia, which was an organization that pretended to fight Dracula, ended up being one to try and resurrect Dracula, but is thankfully stopped by those who happen to have been part of it. That organization shuts down, and they also probably begin to help Alucard's little secret organization, and they decide to pick one of the members of the Weigel villagers who happen to have some kind of promising vampire hunting child. That, of course, happening to be Quincy Morris, in his older, more grosser looking form, like he is in the Dracula novel, where after, sucking some life back into him, then tries to steal a woman and then is stabbed to death by Quincy Morris. He also does not die the same way Quincy Morris does in the actual novel, and dies later for whatever reason, but that is the reason why he is then given the vampire killer whip. It is after several years of training that his son, John Morris, alongside the most recent in the Lacard clan, that being Eric Lacard with the Alucard spear, go to fight the almost going to be resurrected Dracula by his supposed niece, somehow using the souls in the now happening World War I. Both of them inevitably fight against Dracula and defeat him. Seemingly, John Morris is incapable of firmly controlling the power of the whip, and it leads to his death. His son, Jonathan Morris, keeps it, but then uses other weapons to fight against monsters as he teams up with his childhood friend, one of the descendants of the Belmonts clan, Charlotte Allen, who ultimately then go off to investigate the apparent reappearance of Castlevania, as a new vampire has decided to use its power to do whatever he wants. During World War II, this vampire is using the spirits of World War II, which he, I believe, started, in order to basically utilize Dracula's power for himself. Though obviously it is a spoiler for the game, Eric Lacard's daughters are taken from him as he is killed by Bronner, and he turns Stella and Loretta against him, turning them into vampires, having them firmly believe that they are his daughters. After going through the castle and its many displeasures, they eventually meet up with Stella and Loretta, fight them, and are able to bring them back to their senses temporarily in order for them to help Jonathan firmly understand how to control the vampire killer whip. By somehow contacting the souls of his ancestors and gaining their powers, mostly Richter for some reason. Jonathan Morris is seemingly the last person to actually use the vampire hunter whip in the Morris clan. I like to imagine him and Charlotte do get together, but that's not really as important. It's more likely kept under wraps and in secret by the secret organization made by Alucard, probably being kept safe by Shinoa, whose descendant more than likely brings it back to the main group. We'll get there in a second. But of course, let's get back to the main line. Where exactly does Victor Belmont lead? Now, of course, in reality, in the actual canon, hell, even if you include spin-off stuff, the answer is it eventually leads into Julius Belmont, who, of course, inevitably in 99, the whole reason why they kept the whip away from the Belmonts is so that they could kill Dracula in a particular year, leading into the last two games in the timeline. So, what's in between? There is several stuff within the Castlevania universe that can just kind of go, sure, here's this. Now, I mentioned a Chinese mobile game of which I don't know actually ever got released in any way, and I certainly will never play. But in that, there is officially a character named Fidel Belmont. He would be around the time frame of when the Morrises have the whip, so he'd have his own whip doing his own thing. Here's the thing, I'd like to imagine him and his sister, Flory Belmont, who I would imagine, died after that game, who really cares, have a third sibling, and that's Michael Belmont. There needs to be a Michael R. Belmont, who apparently helped train John Morris in order for him to fully understand the whip, and it's probable that he himself went on his own adventures to fight either a vampire or Dracula in some way, and he is the guy who is the vampire hunter from the arcade game. This Castlevania the Arcade, not the Haunted Castle arcade game, but Castlevania the Arcade, light gun game that is, you can kind of either play as him, a shooter, a witch, and all three probably teamed up to fight against whatever vampire is in the game. I believe it's Dracula, but it's also not really important. Either way, this character is totally canon, and he's neat. I have a name for the father of these characters, which is Tyrell Belmont, a character that I've kind of just made my own character in the Dungeons & Dragons game that I play with my friends. I liked the name Tyrell. It just made sense with the name of his son, and I just kind of ran with it, and now I'm keeping it. And also the art for this character, of which I don't know where it comes from. I'm pretty sure it's from that game. I genuinely don't know. Inevitably, this would lead to Simon Belmont. That's right, Simon Belmont, all the way in the future, is a movie actor in the other one of the game books, that being Legend of the Old Castle, where, of course, inevitably he has to reenact the events of the original Castlevania with the original Simon. But I raised to you the idea that he is the third of his section, and that he is Simon Belmont the sixth. Time for some crackpot theories. The exact numbering of the years lines up for the every 100 years or so thing that is established in the series until 99, where ultimately you need to explain when exactly was the last time he came about and why that eventually would lead to 99. This means at some point there needs to have been a Belmont who needed to defeat Dracula in a different year than he was initially defeated, which means when he was reborn that one time, he did not die, and soon afterwards was defeated by another Simon Belmont. The events of the PS1 version of Simon's Adventure, I established to you, were done by not the Simon of the original, but a separate Simon. Simon the Fourth, who looks like a twink and not a twunk, the same way the original one did. This guy, who looks very similar to Light Yagami from Death Note, is the guy who went off and fought Dracula in a particular year in order for it to line up with the actually established timeline. Someone needed to firmly reset the thing, which means to me that there is, looking at the times, I think there are times where Dracula partially is resurrected and times where Dracula is fully resurrected. And in the one time where he is fully resurrected but not fully defeated, sometime during the Morrises, we get one of the Belmonts who was told by his dad, Fidel, that they need to, continue the Belmont legacy, that he defeats a Dracula. Now, I don't think he has the whip necessarily, although that is possible that it does join the main line during this time frame, but who knows? But I raise you the idea that this Simon is the one that fully defeated Dracula, a much weakened Dracula within Castlevania, and he would continue teaching his line for the inevitable day that Dracula would return and need to be defeated. His son would be Simon Belmont V. That's what I'm putting the weird one from the Captain N show right here. If I'm going to take from a multitude of Castlevania sources and go, though that thing isn't canon, this character is, then I'm going to take that guy. However, considering what he's dressed up as, he probably was part of the Air Force and died during the war, and I'm totally fine with that assertion. His son, who would also be named Simon, would of course reenact the actions of his similarly named ancestor and would marry Lucy. The two of them would have a son who would then have a grandson. Who's a son, you ask? Well, how about the playable Castlevania character who is in Evolution Skateboarding, a Konami skateboarding game that barely anyone has played? Frogger and Stolid Snake are also playable characters in that game, so do I think that those games are canon? Maybe. But I do totally think that there was totally a skateboarder, maybe named Tony, like Tony Hawk, who fought a vampire and other monsters using skateboarding. That would just be very funny to me. Regardless of when it is, whether it being Simon or Simon, I do think that Sepia Belmont, a character that does exist elsewhere in the universe, she is from Bomber Girls, a Bomberman-based big game that is about anime girls that obviously, again, I don't think that's canon unless you want to get wacky. Well, that character could be. Hell, maybe she could have even been some kind of person who dealt with the, bomb squad in real life. But I would imagine she's a descendant of Shinoa due to the fact that their designs kind of have similar bases to them. Again, doesn't need to be firmly connected, and Sepia could be entirely unrelated and also seemingly part of the secret organization that Alucard is in, but regardless, this character does incorporate the vampire killer in their moveset from Bomber Girls, so I'd imagine this is when the actual vampire killer whip is brought back to the main line of the Belmonts. Again, I'm not sure if it's Simon or Simon that is who she marries into the family with. I would imagine Simon the Fifth here, the guy who dies during the war, and that she is the mother of Simon the Sixth, a movie actor, who of course was the reason why it was on set in the first place, who uses it to specifically fight off a almost fully resurrected Dracula. The events of the 99 fight against Dracula are actually not fully established. We don't know what happened there or who was involved. It could be a multitude of characters from a multitude of different lines of the Belmont clans, but who knows? Maybe his sister, who of course is from a Gradius type spinoff that is involved anime girls, and she is specifically described as Julius Belmont's sister in that game, which is funny. But it is thanks to Julius that Dracula is finally and fully destroyed. His soul is kind of left to the ether, and the power of chaos is just kind of left adrift, with others now trying to vie for its power. Thus, we get the events of Dracula's resurrection. Ultimately, he is resurrected into a whole new body. Thus, we get Soma Cruz. Childhood friends with Mina Hakuba, he would ultimately have to deal with the fact that a multitude of people are trying to basically turn him back into Dracula. Thus, we get the two Sorrow games, Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow. Soma Cruz gets forced into this war against darkness as he is forced to almost vie for the potential of being the new Lord of Darkness, and also helping Julius Belmont remember who he is because he nearly forgets. He actually fights against the very demonic force that helped Dracula become Dracula as he fully gets rid of Dracula's influence. Oddly enough, this is in the first part of that two-parter there because Dawn of Sorrow continues on the DS. Now you know why it's called that. A cult known as With Light, which Soma Cruz, in order to fully resurrect the Dark Lord in turn, in order to sort of balance out the world, because they believe they're the, like, purveyors of light, but they're also just really evil, so, you know, fuck them. After that whole deal, ultimately, Julius Belmont tries to continue teaching more people the ways of the Belmont legacy, ultimately taking on an apprentice with Curtis Lang. Curtis Lang is only really seen in one audio drama where he becomes good friends with, what do you know, Michelle the Nasty, who might be related to another character from the Sorrow games whose name was Hammer, who is kind of like implied to be part of the Dynasty clan, but who knows. If Julius has children, it's unclear, but I'd like to imagine he's probably the father of Victor Belmont II. A much further in the future Victor Belmont is seen in Lord of the Shadow, and if we're taking characters from that, might as well have an alternate version of him as well. Maybe he'll continue the line, and eventually will result in a big robot all the way far in the future in Contra Hardcore. Remember that is an actual character that exists in that game. Until we get to that point, the only real future parts that we know are stuff that was mentioned before. Alucard still has a secret organization, which is ultimately looking into weird, strange things. It's mostly involving the Grimoire. This Grimoire, which basically has written down everyone's lives, apparently brings those tales to life, and they have to deal with the fact that it bleeds into reality. Oddly, this retcons certain other Konami games into the canon, so off somewhere further off in Japan, there's crazy demons being fought by samurais, but that's a whole other story. These are two games that are kind of the most recent part of the timeline and are sort of where we leave off in terms of our Castlevania lore, right? There is a secret group looking into weird mystic things, and unfortunately the most that we have is a shittier app game all about nothing. Supposedly way even further in the future, there is, of course, you know, Kid Dracula? Kid Dracula, who may or may not be Alucard. I would imagine it is not Alucard, and that Kid Dracula is his own thing in some way. It could be that Kid Dracula is the son of Alucard, but maybe not the Alucard you'd think. Before we fully wrap this up, I'd like to introduce the most crackpot theory that I have. The Castlevania Judgement Theory. In Castlevania Judgment, there is, of course, a multitude of characters throughout the timeline, but all of them look a lot different due to the fact they were all drawn by the same artist who, of course, did Death Note. Ooh, that's the reason I mentioned him before. That's right, I propose that this man is the same Simon that was Simon the Fourth. Same red hair and everything. I mentioned a Trevor all the way before, and this is part of that theory. All the characters that are in that game are in fact relatives of the characters that they're being named as. And the man who is part of the same time travel organization of that one guy from the PS2 game is newer, and he's not as accurate as he thinks, and he gets all of their relatives who happen to have the same names. If we've established that Simon Belmont III can be a thing that I established to you, then why not other times in this family tree that there are other times that other people were named Simon? Whether it be descendant or ancestor, I think each of these characters are directly related to the characters that we know and love, but because they are so different in terms of the way they act and the way they look, I can't just go, oh, Castlevania Judgment isn't canon, because that's boring. They're all relatives with the same names. If not a junior or the third, they're somewhere further down the line. Just look at the separate parts in my little family tree of right when we get to certain parts of the timeline, there has to be a multitude of parts of these families. So there's a multitude of people that assuredly could have easily been named the same name. And considering the fact that they continued the whole passing of different styles of fighting and magic and combat, it's probable that one of them had a similar vibe to their descendant or ancestor. We know there's multiple Camillas. There was probably a multitude of other Cornells and Golems. Well, the real question remains, what about that Dracula and Alucard? Surely there can't be a multitude of Draculas and Alucards. I've established earlier in the thing that it's impossible for there to be another Dracula and Alucard. Well, here they are, I guess. I don't know. This is the hardest part of the theory of, like, if all of them are different, then they gotta be too. But the Alucard there is Kid Dracula, baby! That's right, and this Alucard can't be that Alucard, because that Alucard is a whole other dude now. That's right, Kid Dracula, I'm establishing, is the Alucard from Castlevania Judgement, who's a different Alucard than the other Alucard. And I think the character development that was in Lords of Shadow doesn't happen to Gabriel Belmont. It happens to a similarly named Gabriel Belmont, who is the son of the other little section of our timeline. Remember that Belmont that didn't have descendants? It was his son. And the reason that we don't know he has descendants is because nobody talks about that side of the family. It was he who, not during the time frame that the Lords of Shadow established as it happening, which could not fit with what is in the main timeline, but it is he who a little bit later in the timeline would be attacked by the villagers, stuck all the way in on the undergrounds, and would be found in modern day times by Victor Belmont, who would then of course help him do some dumb stealth stuff as he turned into a little rat or whatever. If you really want to get crazy, maybe his son, who maybe was also called Trevor, and maybe his son, who was also called Simon, did the same thing in Mirror of Fate that they do in the Lord of Shadow timeline. And let's just get absolutely crazy with it and establish all kinds of stuff. But that's where Kid Dracula comes from, a whole separate side of the family that decided to do the same route. And fate is inevitable, as is Kid Dracula. Kid Dracula is inevitable. Oh boy, you think that's it? Maybe, in fact, there's more to this. Maybe every single different version of Simon or Christopher's or other Simons' adventures are all because of time fluctuations, thanks to this time war that's going on with the Time Reaper and the Time People. Everything's been shifted, and maybe none of this matters. Maybe everything's canon even more so than I think. But as you can see, the Castlevania series is long and expansive. There is a lot to go over. There's a whole bunch of other characters I don't have time to go over. So much of it is entertaining and strange, and a lot of it, throughout the ups and downs, are lots of fun adventures to go on, a lot of which will kick your ass sideways because Castlevania is incredibly hard. But regardless of how challenging the series is, the Castlevania series is one that I adore. And it's one that I absolutely look forward to whatever will be made in the future. Now, hey, do I think all of this is exactly how it should be, or that this is the way you should look at the series? No, you can do whatever you want. Again, use your imagination. I'm not the one dictating how things should go. But neither should someone who hasn't been part of the franchise for a decade and a half at this point. Castlevania, due to how odd it can be, is all up to its viewers, and I think headcanon is something which is something worthwhile to look at. There's no laws with these things. Enjoy your life, use your imagination, and this is me doing that. If Konami let me, I'd totally retcon a few of these things and maybe add some things to make a little bit more of these oddities and strange things make a bit more sense. Probably piss off all the fan base because they probably go, why they make the crackpot theory guy make the canon fan book? But I am no master of the Grimoire of Souls. I be but a fan of Castlevania, and I hope you too are fans of Castlevanias. So, regardless of whether or not you agree with any of this, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you stick around and make sure you subscribe to check out all the other kinds of canon-busting BS that I decide to make within the future. And also, I hope you leave a like and share it to everyone that you know to the point of annoyance. Most importantly, I hope you have a good day, stay good, stay safe, don't be an asshole.